Complete Chess Strategy, Part 7, Your Thought Process, Complete Game, by ChessDiagnostic. Hello everyone, and welcome to what is turning out to be the third part of Part 7. So in the previous two lessons, we analyzed the four-step thought process, and then we went through a tactical puzzle, and in this lesson we're going to go through a complete game. We'll see how the four-step thought process morphs through the opening, the middle game, and the endgame. And so I'm going to separate the lessons into those areas within the lesson. So this is a game by Capablanca, one of his earlier games, and we're going to see how he plays against his opponent Antonio Fiol. Now I wanted to use a game by a very strong player so we can see that this thought process can be used on a very high level. Alright, so I'm going to explain every single move using the thought process. And it might seem a little tedious, but I want you to understand how it goes through the whole game, and how if you use it consistently, that you'll play very well. And that's really the most important thing, is using it consistently. You know, if you, even for a move, if you skip a step, then that's when blunders occur. If you skip a blunder check, if you skip step 2 trying to find candidates and you just start calculating, that's really the foundation of chess strength, is applying information consistently, not just amassing tons of information. Alright, so white started with e4, and black needs to find a move. So we go through step 1. Now in the opening, step 1 is finding the opponent's threats. In the opening there's really no threats. And the reason there's no threats is because there's no contact between the pieces. Each player is in his own territory, so to speak. Alright, so after e4 has been played, we go to step 2. We know that there's 4 rules that we can use, which is the rule of centralization, the rule of the least active piece, and the rule of the attack, which is normally during the middle game, but it can be in the opening if your opponent makes a mistake in development, and then basically getting rid of or trading the opponent's pieces. Alright, so normally you want to develop your least active piece in the opening. That's the main focus. Since all your pieces are sitting on the first rank or the 8th rank if you're black, and other than the knights, which you can develop without moving a pawn, you'll need to move either one of these central pawns to get your bishop, your knight, your bishop, your queen, and your rook out. So, alright, so Capablanca starts with e5, and step 3 is calculation. There really doesn't need to be any calculation. Other moves are fine. You can play knight to f6, knight to c6, but he starts by putting a pawn in the center, as well as giving free range to the bishop and the queen. So the blunder check is, there's really no blunder check because there's no forcing replies by white. Alright, so we'll move on here. Alright, so white moved knight to f3. Step 1 is finding the purpose of this move. So white is threatening the e5 pawn as well as developing a piece, and we need to find a way to defend it. So step 2 is we need to figure out how to increase our activity while also protecting material. Now there's multiple ways to do it. We can move the pawn up, the bishop, but pretty much the least active piece that could do it is the knight. And so that's the one that Capablanca decides to develop. Now step 3 is calculation. Well, there's really no calculation to do since it's the opening, and we can see that if we move knight to c6, now if white makes a forcing reply knight to e5, then we'll just simply recapture with our knight. Alright, so now white has developed another piece. It looks like he's trying to hit the f7 square, but that's not really a threat. So we're still focusing on the least active piece in the opening. We want to develop the knight to f6. We can develop the bishop to c5 or here. So Capablanca chose knight to f6. And now we know there's still no calculation, and in terms of a blunder check, white could take here, and he could take here, but we know that the king can take, and the knight can take. So there's really no risk. Alright, so now white has castled, and he's planning to develop his other pieces. There's still no threats, so we need to find our move. So we know we want to castle, because we want to keep our king safe, but we also want to connect our rooks, and castling is a huge part of that. So before we can do that, we need to develop our minor pieces. So the normal simple strategy in the opening is to focus on the least active piece, which is mostly your minor pieces first, your knights and your bishops, and then your heavier pieces, your rook and queen. But you want to do those in that order. The minor pieces, and then your rooks, and then your queen. Because if you bring the queen out too early, it can just be attacked by the opponent's minor pieces if he's developing correctly. Alright, so Capablanca chose to move the bishop here. He's planning to castle. There's still no calculation, and now white can take here and here again as we analyze, but there's still no threats. Alright, so white played d3, and he's obviously just planning to develop his knight here and then bring his bishop out. So there's still no threats. We know that we still need to develop all our pieces, and so we're going to plan to castle here. Step 3, there's really no calculation, and there's still no threats. So we castle. Alright, white has brought his knight out. Basically, he's 2 moves away from connecting his rooks, being finished with development, and we're going to keep developing our pieces. White can bring the knight in here, but there's really no threat of material. White's still threatening here and here, but there's nothing else to look at. So we know we want to develop our bishop and our rook, eventually connecting our rooks. And so the only way to do that is to either move the pawn up to get it out of the way so we can get our bishop out. Capablanca chose d6. Alright, so we can see that there's a move back. Now, at this point, after the bishop's done, then pretty much we'll enter the middle game. Alright, so now we're in the middle game, and we know that because basically white is threatening to play f4, as well as increase his control in the center. So we need to shift our thinking from just developing our least active piece to starting a direct attack or control in the center. So Capablanca decides to play bishop to e6, and we can see that white doesn't really have any threats, but we know that we want to start an attack and to contest the center. So this shift in our thinking will help us to enter the middle game with a strong position. So white played knight to d5, and we can see that white is threatening the knight on f6 as well as the bishop. But there's really no threats that we can't meet. So if we look at our move, we know that we need to start an attack. And our attack should be in the center, but since the center is blocked right now, we can start a wing attack. And that's a good thing to remember, is that when there's nothing to do in the center, you need to basically concentrate all your forces on the side. When the center starts to weaken or to be open, then you need to concentrate your pieces back there. And so Capablanca decides to play knight to a5. He decides to attack this bishop and gain a slight material advantage because the bishop is stronger than the knight. So if you can trade your knight for your opponent's bishop, then it's definitely an advantage. Alright, so white decided to basically lock his bishop in, and now if the knight captures, he's thinking he'll reinforce his pawn structure. Now the drawback of this is that not only does it reduce the bishop's activity, but it weakens these squares as well as his overall pawn structure. Now Capablanca takes advantage of this by creating weak pawns on the queen side. So Another benefit of knight to a5 is that we can also chase this knight back and advance our pawns. So the computer says that this is actually the best move, to just take the knight, but Capablanca decides to move a piece back. Now, just because Capablanca decides to move a piece back doesn't mean it's the best move. It's definitely not, and if we look at the computer's evaluation, it's not a losing move, of course, but it's not the strongest. So, from our general understanding, we know that we need to increase our piece's activity. And this move back not only does it move back, but it takes the piece out of the center. Alright, so white decides to take our knight on f6. There's two ways to recapture. We can take with the pawn or with the bishop. But we know, based on our overall understanding of activity, we don't want to take with the pawn because it'll block our bishop. And it'll also weaken our king position. So there's really only one choice, and that's to take the knight back. Alright, so we can see step one is that white moved to b4 and he's threatening our knight. Now, just because you're threatened doesn't mean you should automatically respond to the threat. You should definitely keep the whole board in mind. But in this particular position, there's really only two moves, which is basically moving the knight back or taking the bishop. And as we discussed before, we know that we want to win material, so black basically takes on c4 and he increases his activity because now he has two bishops versus these two pieces who aren't even in the center at all. In addition to the past moves, white has created these two pawn weaknesses for himself. And black starts right away to attack those weaknesses because now we have a concrete object to attack. And as you can see, just from general play, from the general strategy of trading the bishop for the knight, as well as contesting the center, which originally the bishop was here, and as you can see, it was a mistake because now black simply moves it back again to attack the pawn. So now that weaknesses have been induced, that black focuses all of his energy to attack those pawns. Of course, white uses his queen to protect this pawn, but there's really nothing else that he can do. So, alright, so at this point, Capablanca decides to play a5 and to further induce pawn weaknesses by forcing white to either move it forward or to trade it and give his rook the file. So the overall strategy is not too complicated. In the middle game, you simply need to attack. You need to find an object for attack, and if you can't find an object, you simply need to move your pieces forward, contest the center, and try to induce weaknesses of the opponent. Now, trading your knight for a bishop is a way to gain a material advantage, however slight, and attacking the weak pawns is the main way to gain a quantitative advantage. So, white is trying to reinforce his pawn mass, but it's pretty weak at this point, and as you can see, Capablanca is focusing all of his, well, not this bishop necessarily, but all of his pieces so far on attacking the weaknesses. So his kind of amorphous strategy, general, transformed into a concrete strategy to win material. His qualitative advantage is transferring to a quantitative advantage. So Capablanca plays c6 because he's trying to basically bring his queen out, connect his rooks, and bear all of his forces down on these pawns to win one. So white plays this move because he's going to be threatening d6. And now the queen can't move here. So with this move, white is basically restricting his activity. And black could move here and then bring the rook over, but that's a little slow. So Capablanca still wants to attack these pawns, and he basically just brings his bishop back, which also prepares f5. Alright, so white, after quite a few moves, has finally played f4. So as we can see from step 1, he's basically threatening, he has a real threat now, he's threatening to push my bishop back which would greatly decrease its activity on these squares, as well as he could keep advancing it, and he can get his bishop out. So from step 2, we know that we want to increase our piece's activity and not allow the opponent to do it, or to allow him to decrease our activity. So there's also a tactical opportunity here. So if we trade, which if white wants to keep his pawn, because otherwise we'd play g5 on the next move, protecting our pawn, we can trade these pawns, and then we have a check with our queen. And because the last move, this bishop is protecting d6, we'd actually win a pawn, turning our qualitative advantage into a quantitative advantage. And so that's the line that Capablanca goes for. He first trades the pawn, and then he takes this pawn, checking the king. Alright, so instead of moving the king back and just allowing him to take this pawn, he basically gives black a huge advantage now. So, as you can see, just from this general strategy, black has already won 2 pawns. Alright, so at this point we can evaluate that black has basically won 2 pawns. He's gained a 2-pawn material advantage, and he did that by following a simple strategy. There was nothing too complicated here. What he did was he recognized, once the knight moved back, that white was planning to start an attack with f4. Now, that signaled the beginning of the middle game, and now when your opponent's planning a wing attack, what you want to do is you want to start an attack in the center, or you want to contest the center. And black did that by simply developing his bishop and contesting these central squares. And once white blocked it off by moving his knight to d5, black started his own wing attack by moving his knight to a5, and first winning a material advantage by trading his knight for the opponent's bishop. And now white helped black by creating weaknesses of his own by moving his pawn to b3 and then eventually to b4. Now black, using tactical complications, won a material advantage because white helped him create his own weaknesses. Now at this point, we can see the computer's evaluating 3.1 advantage for black, negative 3.1, which is totally winning advantage. And in addition, his pieces are sitting on the first rank other than his queen and his bishop, and black has the bishop pair in addition to be able to bring his rook in. Now, black wants to trade though and enter endgame because when you're up material advantage, you want to trade because it reduces the ability for your opponent to fight back. And that's exactly what happens. So, white basically threatens the queen, which is step 1, his threat, and black forces white to trade. Now, he could try to keep his queen, but it just leads to more material loss. So, white is forced to trade queens. So at this point, we can see that we've gone from a middle game to an endgame. Now, once the queens have been traded, you could say that you're in an endgame, but the main focus or the shift in thinking that you need to do when you're in an endgame is you need to focus on either attacking the opponent's weak pawns or creating and pushing a passed pawn of your own. And you want to prevent your opponent from doing this, of course. So black has a huge advantage, and it's reading at -4 already, so he's totally winning. But in order to convert this advantage into, well, he already has a winning position. But in order to convert this game, what he needs to do is he needs to focus on his strategy of consolidating his pieces and then pushing his passed pawn, because he already has a mass of 3 pawns, and there's nothing white can do to prevent this plan. Now, as you can see, white doesn't really have too many threats, especially with this move. So, black simply takes the free pawn, and now we have 1 rook versus 2 minor pieces. And of course, black has the bishop pair, which is an advantage in and of itself, and he'll use this to basically usher all his pawns down the board. But first he consolidates his position. So I'm not really sure what the point of that move was. Maybe he wants to bring his bishop in, but black can simply just prevent that. But of course, Capablanca also follows the rule of trading or chasing the opponent's pieces back. So he brings his bishop back, and he just starts harassing this rook. Now, it's important to note that in an endgame, time becomes very important, or lack of time becomes very important. So you can take your time. There's really no rush to do anything. You want to take your time to consolidate your position, because there's absolutely nothing that white can do to prevent black from winning. There's no complications he can bring about as long as black plays accurately. As you can see, white moved back. There's really nothing for him to do. Now, of course, black could simply just start pushing his pawns. That's a totally viable strategy. It's very simple, but Capablanca wants to consolidate his position a little more. And he keeps chasing the rook because he wants the rook to go all the way back. Now, with this move, white is threatening this pawn. And so black keeps chasing the opponent's rook. He wants him, and of course, white keeps making the mistake of moving his rook further and further into the opponent's territory. So all these moves are quite simple, just following the rule of attack. As you can see in this position, black has basically chased the white rook into a completely passive corner, with only the bishop protecting it. Now, there's really nothing white can do at this point, because he let himself make all these small errors, and now there's absolutely no hope. So at this point, with the rook totally passive, black starts pushing his passed pawns. So he's following the correct strategy in the endgame. He could go after attacking a weak pawn, but with such a huge pawn advantage, there's no point. He simply just starts pushing his passed pawns, and there's nothing black can do to stop it. So we can see from step one of our thought process that black is going to try to undermine our own pawns on our king side, but even if he did, there's nothing that white can do to get a checkmate or to win a material advantage. Alright, so as you can see, with his king, he's threatening this rook. If he brings the pawn up, then black will simply bring his pawn up, and even though white can take it and win this bishop back, it's still too late. The game's already over. Alright, so that's what white does. He moves this pawn forward, and now black allows that complication. Because now, even though white can take it, black will just keep moving his pawns forward, and as you can see, this rook is totally inactive. It has no activity. It can't do anything. There's no way it could ever even move from this square. Now, the rook should be over here. It should be controlling many squares. But as you can see, the activity of this rook is limited to here. It literally can't go anywhere. And so Capablanca just leaves the rook sitting there and resumes his plan. With a lone knight, there's nothing that a knight can do. It's actually the worst piece to defend against, especially connected passed pawns. So, as you can see, there's not much calculation here at all. And there's not really a blunder check, because there's really nothing white can do to complicate the game and force a win for himself. Now, white's threatening to go here and stop the advancing of that pawn, but if this was a lone pawn, then it might need some help from the rook, but it doesn't even need help from the rook. This other pawn will keep pushing, and eventually it'll promote and win that knight, in addition to all of all of white's other material. As you can see, these two bishops are just totally ushering in these pawns from afar, and after this move, white resigned. Now, as we can see, this is the end of the game. And now if black moves here, then white can simply push both of the pawns to the 7th rank, and he'll get at least one new queen. So, if we recap the game, it looks so simple. And actually, if you use the right thought process, it does become simple. You just need to apply it on every move. Now, in a lot of positions, there's no one single correct move. You can make multiple moves, but as long as you do it based on your overall understanding, then you'll follow the correct strategy. And as you can see from these, from the opening to the middle game to the end game, that there was definitely a shift in thinking. You can't just think the same way through the entire game. And that's an important part to make, is that you need to recognize once you've entered a certain phase of the game so that you can change your thinking to the correct mode of thinking in order to win the game. Now, if black simply just kept playing in the center based on his middle game understanding, it wouldn't have been as effective as understanding that we're in an endgame and that you need to focus on your pawns. Alright, so I hope this was helpful overall. I know I didn't go through the thought process on every single move, but we'll do that for the last lesson of this course to try to tie everything together. In the next lesson, we're going to go over and review the overall strategic phases of the game, the opening, the middle game, and the end game. So I'll see you there. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about this lesson, and if it helped you to improve your understanding and hopefully to better implement the 4-step thought process. Alright, have a good day.